Sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is stand up for what's right, even when they're all alone. Miss Abigail Carter learned that lesson in the Montana Territory wilderness of 1876, when a gang of outlaws cornered her in the pine woods after she refused their advances. Terrified and helpless, her cries echoed through the trees, until someone answered. Hidden in the morning mist was Elias McGraw, a mountain man who'd been watching from the shadows. Folks said he'd once been a war scout who could vanish like smoke. As the outlaws closed in, a voice growled from the forest, "You boys picked the wrong woods." What happened next became legend, how one man's quiet protection saved a schoolteacher's life. But when the gang's leader came back for revenge, would Elias's guns be enough to protect them both? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 6 months before that morning in the woods, Abigail Carter had stepped off the stagecoach in Ironwood Valley with nothing but 2 carpet bags, a trunk of books, and a heart full of purpose. The town wasn't much to look at, a single muddy street lined with rough-hewn buildings that seemed to lean on each other for support. The Copper Creek Saloon stood at one end, its painted sign faded by mountain weather. At the other end sat the general store, the assayer's office, and a small building that would become her schoolhouse. She was 26 years old, educated at a women's academy in Boston, and determined to bring something her mother had always called civilizing grace to the frontier. Her mother's silver locket hung around her neck, containing a small photograph and a lock of hair, the only pieces of home she'd carried west. Inside that locket was a reminder of why she'd come, her younger brother Samuel, who died at 19 in a Kansas railroad camp, shot over a card game by men who faced no justice because there was no law to face. Abigail had decided then that if the West needed anything, it needed teachers more than it needed guns. It needed children who could read and cipher, who understood that disputes could be settled with words instead of bullets, who might grow up to build something better than their fathers had known. The schoolhouse was one room with a potbelly stove, 12 rough benches, and windows that rattled when the wind came down from the mountains. That first week, 7 children showed up, sons and daughters of prospectors and ranch hands ranging from 6 to 14 years old. They were rough-edged and wary, unaccustomed to sitting still or speaking proper English. But they were hungry for something beyond the hard scrabble of frontier life, and Abigail saw that hunger in their eyes. By the end of her first month, she had 18 students. By the end of 3 months, she had 23. The families were grateful in their own way. The miners would tip their hats when she passed. The ranchers' wives brought her preserves and fresh bread. She boarded with the Pritchard family. John Pritchard ran the livery stable, and his wife Martha had insisted that a schoolteacher shouldn't live alone. Their home was modest but warm, and Martha's cooking reminded Abigail that kindness existed even in hard places. Sundays brought the whole community together. Services were held in the schoolhouse, led by a circuit preacher who came through once a month. On the weeks between his visits, folks gathered anyway, singing hymns and sharing what scripture they remembered. Abigail played the small pump organ someone had hauled over the mountains, and the sound of those voices rising together gave her hope that civilization wasn't just coming to Ironwood Valley. It was already taking root. But the town had another side, one that revealed itself after dark. The Copper Creek Saloon drew men who worked hard and drank harder. Most were harmless, tired laborers looking to forget their aching backs and empty pockets for a few hours. But some came looking for trouble, and trouble generally found them. Fights broke out regularly. The town had a marshal, a weathered man named Clayton, who wore his badge like it was made of lead instead of tin. He broke up the worst of it. But everyone knew Clayton's authority extended only as far as men were willing to respect it. 3 weeks before the incident in the woods, Abigail had her first real encounter with the Hardin gang. She'd been walking back from the general store on a Saturday afternoon. her arms full of supplies for the coming week's lessons. 4 men on horseback had ridden past her, close enough that she had to step into the mud to avoid being trampled. They'd laughed at her stumble, and one of them, a man with a scar running from his eye to his jaw, had tipped his hat in mock courtesy. "Afternoon." "Schoolma'am," he'd said, his voice carrying an edge that made her skin prickle. "Good afternoon," she'd replied, keeping her eyes forward and her pace steady. "You're that teacher everyone's talking about," another one said. This man was older, maybe 40, with dark hair going grey at the temples and eyes that seemed to calculate the worth of everything they landed on. "Miss Carter, isn't it?" "It is." She'd stopped then, because ignoring them seemed more dangerous than acknowledging them. "And you are?" "Dutch Harden." He'd smiled, showing teeth that were surprisingly white against his sun-darkened face. "These are my associates. We work the territorial ranges, help ranchers with their security concerns." What he meant was that they were hired guns, the kind of men who'd do anything for money and ask no questions about the rightness of it. Abigail had heard the term regulator whispered in town, though most folks just called them what they were, outlaws who'd found a way to make their violence look legitimate. "I see," Abigail had said. "Well, I should be getting back." "No need to rush off," Dutch had said, maneuvering his horse to block her path. "We were just saying how nice it is that Ironwood Valley finally has some refinement, a woman of education and grace." The way he'd said grace had made her stomach turn. "I appreciate the sentiment, Mr. Harden, but I really must be going." "Good day." She'd stepped around his horse, heart pounding, and walked back toward the Pritchards' home without looking back. She'd felt their eyes on her the whole way, and heard their laughter follow her down the street. That night, Martha Pritchard had seen her shaken expression and asked what happened. When Abigail told her, Martha's face had gone tight with worry. "Those Harden boys are bad news," Martha had said quietly, glancing toward where her husband sat reading a week-old newspaper. "They've been through here before. Usually they just drink and gamble and move on, but sometimes they get ideas about taking what they want. The marshal won't stand up to them. He's too afraid. What about the territorial law?" Abigail had asked. "Surely there's someone who can keep order." Martha had given her a sad smile. "Out here the only law is what a man can enforce himself. The territorial authorities are 3 days' ride away, and by the time they'd arrive, whatever's going to happen has already happened." Abigail had thought about that conversation often in the days that followed. She'd also started hearing stories about someone else, a man who lived up in the high country, far from town. Elias McGraw was more legend than fact in Ironwood Valley. Some said he'd been a cavalry scout during the war, that he'd ridden with Sheridan and knew every trail from Virginia to the Rockies. Others claimed he'd lived with the Crow Indians and learned their ways, that he could track a whisper through stone and disappear into country that would kill a normal man. A few insisted he was a deserter who'd gone mad with guilt and now haunted the mountains like a ghost. What everyone agreed on was that he kept to himself. He came into town maybe twice a year to trade furs for supplies, spoke to no one, and vanished back into the wilderness before anyone could ask him questions. Some of the children claimed to have seen him watching from the tree line during recess, though Abigail had always assumed this was imagination running wild. She'd taken to walking in the evenings, when the teaching day was done and before supper at the Pritchards'. There was a path that led from town into the pine woods, not far, just enough to find some quiet and clear her head. The forest had a way of settling her thoughts, reminding her that there was something bigger and older than the small troubles of frontier life. It was on one of those walks, 2 weeks after her encounter with Dutch Harden, that she'd seen the first real sign that the stories about Elias McGraw might be true. She'd been standing beneath a tall pine, watching the late afternoon light filter through the needles, when she'd noticed something carved into the bark. It was a symbol she didn't recognize, 3 lines intersecting at angles with a small circle at the center. Below it, carved in careful letters, were the words, "The Mountain Watches." She'd run her fingers over the carving, wondering who had made it and what it meant. The wood was weathered, the message old. She hadn't known then that she was standing at the edge of Elias McGraw's territory, or that he'd been watching the town and her for longer than anyone realized. She hadn't known that in just a few days. Everything would change. The Saturday that changed everything started like any other. Abigail had spent the morning preparing lessons for the coming week, mending a torn page in one of her precious textbooks and helping Martha Pritchard with the washing. The afternoon was warm for late autumn, the kind of day that made you forget winter was coming. Around 4 o'clock, young Thomas Brennan, a ranch hand who'd taken a shine to helping around town, stopped by the Pritchards to let her know that a package had arrived for her at the general store. Books she'd ordered from a catalogue 3 months prior, finally delivered by freight wagon from Helena. Abigail had been so excited she'd barely remembered to grab her shawl before hurrying into town. The store was busy with Saturday shoppers, and she'd spent a pleasant half-hour talking with Mrs. Henderson, the shopkeeper's wife, about the new McGuffey readers she'd received. Other women had stopped to chat, and before she knew it, the sun was starting its descent toward the mountains. She'd left the store with her parcel wrapped in brown paper, planning to head straight back to the Pritchards. But as she stepped onto the wooden sidewalk, she'd heard her name called from across the street. Dutch Harden stood outside the Copper Creek Saloon, one boot propped on the hitching rail. 3 of his men flanked him, the scarred one she remembered, plus 2 others she hadn't seen before. All 4 were watching her with expressions that made her clutch the package tighter to her chest. "Miss Carter," Dutch called again, louder this time. "Come have a drink with us. We're celebrating." Several townspeople on the street had stopped to watch. Abigail felt their eyes on her, felt the weight of the moment. Refusing would embarrass him. Accepting would be worse. "Thank you for the invitation, Mr. Harden, but I don't drink spirits, and I need to get home before dark." She'd kept her voice level. "Polite but firm. Just one drink," Dutch had insisted, stepping into the street. "A respectable woman like yourself could teach us some manners. Lord knows we could use the education." His men had laughed at that, and the sound carried an edge that made her skin crawl. "I'm sure you're fine, gentlemen, as you are," Abigail had said, taking a step backward. "But I really must decline. Good evening." She turned and started walking, her heart hammering against her ribs. Behind her she'd heard Dutch's voice rise in anger. "You think you're too good for us? Is that it? Too refined for rough men?" Abigail had kept walking, faster now. The street seemed longer than it ever had before. "I'm talking to you." Dutch had shouted, and she'd heard his boots on the wooden planks coming after her. She'd broken into a near run then, abandoning dignity for safety. She'd cut through the alley between the assayer's office and the feed store, heading for the path that would take her back to the Pritchards. It was the same path she walked for her evening strolls, the one that led through the pine woods. The mistake was thinking the trees would hide her. The mistake was not realizing that Dutch Harden's pride had been wounded in front of his men, in front of the whole town. And that kind of wound demanded satisfaction. She'd made it perhaps 200 yards into the woods when she'd heard the horses behind her. 4 riders moving fast through the trees. She'd tried to run, but her skirts caught on the undergrowth, and the package of books tumbled from her arms. They'd circled her like wolves cornering prey. Now that wasn't very polite, Dutch had said, dismounting slowly. Walking away when a man's trying to have a civil conversation. "Please," Abigail had managed, hating the tremor in her voice. "Please just let me go home." "We will," Dutch had assured her, moving closer. "Soon as we have that drink I mentioned. And maybe you can teach us those manners you're so proud of." The scarred man had laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Yeah, teach us real good." Abigail had backed against a tree, her mind racing. Scream? Who would hear? Run? They had horses. Fight? Against 4-armed men? "There's no need for this," she'd said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Whatever you think I've done to offend you, I apologize. And please just let me go." Dutch had reached out and grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh through the fabric of her dress. "See, that's your problem, Miss Carter. You think words fix everything. You think being educated makes you better than folks like us. I don't—" "Shut up!" His voice had gone cold. "You had your chance to be friendly back in town. Now you'll learn what happens when you disrespect a man in front of his crew. One of the other men had dismounted, moving to block her escape route. The scarred one was grinning. The fourth stayed on his horse, but his hand rested on the pistol at his hip. Abigail had done the only thing she could think of. She'd screamed, loud and long, a cry for help that echoed through the pine trees and scattered the birds from their roosts. Dutch had backhanded her across the face, and she'd tasted blood. "Nobody's coming to help you," he'd snarled. "We're alone out here, and you boys picked the wrong woods." The voice had come from everywhere and nowhere, a low growl that seemed to rise from the forest itself. All four men had frozen, hands moving to their weapons, eyes scanning the trees. "Who's there?" Dutch had called out, trying to sound authoritative, but unable to hide the edge of fear. "Show yourself! Let her go." The voice had come from a different direction this time, 20 yards to the left. "Mount up and ride out, and maybe you'll see tomorrow." "Like hell," the scarred man had spat, drawing his pistol. "There's 4 of us and 1 of you, whoever you are." True enough. Now the voice came from behind them. "But I'm already aiming at you, and you're just now figuring out where I am." Abigail had seen him then, a shape materializing from the shadows between the trees. Tall and lean, dressed in buckskin and wool, with a rifle that looked like it had seen a war. His face was weathered and hard, framed by dark hair shot through with gray. His eyes were the color of flint, and they held no mercy. Elias McGraw. "You're that mountain man," Dutch had said, his grip on Abigail loosening slightly. "The crazy hermit." "Hermit, yes. Crazy's debatable." Elias had raised the rifle to his shoulder, a Sharps .50 caliber that could drop a buffalo at 300 yards. "But I'm a fair shot, and from this distance, I won't miss. There's 4 of us," Dutch had repeated. But his voice had lost its conviction. "And I've got 4 rounds." Elias had taken 3 steps closer, moving with the fluid grace of a man who knew how to walk silent through the wilderness. "Plus the knife at my belt, which I'm partial to. And these woods know me better than you know your own names. You want to test those odds?" The scarred man had kept his pistol aimed at Elias. "You shoot, we shoot. Maybe you get 1 or 2 of us, but we'll get you." "Maybe." Elias had smiled, and it was a terrible thing to see. "But I'll get him first." The rifle had shifted slightly, aimed directly at Dutch's chest. "Your boss dies, then what? You get my furs and my claim? Or you just get to explain to whoever comes asking why you couldn't handle one old hermit?" The moment had stretched out, taut as a bowstring. Abigail had barely dared to breathe. It was Dutch who'd blinked first. "This isn't over," he'd said, releasing Abigail's arm and stepping back. "You just made an enemy, old man." "Get on your horses," Elias had ordered, his voice flat and cold. "Drop your gun belts first. All of you." "The hell we will," the scarred man had protested. Elias had fired, not at the men, but at a tree branch directly above the scarred man's head. The Sharps had roared like thunder, and the branch had exploded into splinters that rained down on the outlaw. The man had yelped and stumbled backward. "Gun belts," Elias had repeated, already reloading with practiced efficiency. "Or the next one takes somebody's ear off." One by one, they'd unbuckled their weapons and let them fall to the forest floor. Elias had gestured with his rifle toward their horses. "Mount up. Ride back to town. Pick up your guns from the marshal tomorrow. You're a dead man," Dutch had promised, climbing back onto his horse. "I'll see you gutted and left for the crows." "I've heard that before," Elias had said. "From better men than you?" They'd ridden off, leaving their gun belts behind and their pride in tatters. When the sound of hoofbeats had faded, Elias had lowered his rifle and turned to Abigail. "You hurt?" She touched her split lip, feeling the sting of it. "I'll live." "Thank you." "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't." "I know what would have happened." He'd cut her off, his voice gentler now. "That's why I was watching." "You were watching me?" "I watched the town. These woods are my territory. I see things." He'd bent to gather up the gun belts, slinging them over his shoulder. "These men have been trouble before. I had a feeling they'd be trouble again." Abigail had retrieved her fallen package of books, brushing pine needles from the brown paper. "I'm Abigail Carter, the school teacher. I know who you are." He'd offered his hand, and she'd taken it. His grip was strong but careful, the hand of a man who knew his own strength. Elias McGraw. Folks call me the Mountain Man, I guess. Will they really come back? Elias had looked in the direction the outlaws had gone, his expression grim. That Dutch Harden's got pride like a sickness. And you just saw him humiliated twice in one day, once by you in town, once by me in these woods. Men like that don't forget. What should I do? Let me walk you back to town. He'd started down the path and she'd followed. After that, I'll figure something out. But Miss Carter, those men are dangerous. Real dangerous. You need to understand that. I do now. They'd walked in silence for a while, until the lights of Ironwood Valley came into view through the trees. At the edge of town, Elias had stopped. I'll leave you here. Don't want to cause more talk than necessary. Will I see you again? He'd looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable in those flint-grey eyes. Probably. I have a feeling this isn't finished. He'd melted back into the trees then, as silent as he'd appeared, leaving Abigail standing at the boundary between the wild country and the fragile civilization of Ironwood Valley. She'd walked home with her books clutched to her chest and the taste of blood still on her lip, knowing that everything had changed. The man who'd saved her was a mystery. The men who'd threatened her were nursing wounded pride and plotting revenge, and somewhere between those two, backs lay a reckoning that was coming as sure as winter 3 weeks after the incident in the woods. Ironwood Valley held its breath. The deadline Dutch Harden had set was approaching, and everyone knew something was coming. The only question was what form it would take. Elias had disappeared into the mountains after the scarred man's visit, and for 3 days Abigail saw no sign of him. She taught her classes and went about her routine, but her eyes kept drifting to the tree line, searching for a figure that never appeared. At night, she lay awake in the small room at the Pritchards', the derringer under her pillow, listening to every creak and groan of the settling house. On the 4th day, he came to her just after dawn, appearing at the schoolhouse door like a ghost. He looked haggard, as if he hadn't slept, and there was something in his eyes she'd never seen before. Defeat. I have to tell you the truth, he said without preamble, about what Harden found, about what I did. They sat on the schoolhouse steps in the grey light of early morning, and Elias told her a story that made her understand why he'd hidden in the mountains for so long. It had been 1864, late in the war. Elias had been scouting for Sheridan's army in the Shenandoah Valley, where Confederate guerrillas were burning Union supplies and ambushing patrols. One of the officers in his unit was a lieutenant named Dutch Harden, ambitious and cruel, who saw the war as an opportunity for advancement and personal enrichment. Harden had led a raid on a small Virginia town suspected of harboring Confederate sympathizers. Orders had been to search for weapons and supplies, but Harden had turned it into something else, a rampage of violence against civilians. Homes burned, men shot without trial, women and children brutalized in ways that made Elias's voice crack when he spoke of it. Elias had tried to stop it, had physically pulled Harden away from one family and threatened to shoot him if he didn't call off his men. Harden had laughed and said this was war, and war made its own rules. When they'd returned to camp, Elias had reported what happened, filed an official complaint, testified at Harden's court-martial with every ugly detail he could remember. They didn't hang him, Elias said, staring at his hands. They should have, but they didn't. Too many officers doing the same things, too much politics involved. They dishonorably discharged him instead, sent him west with a black mark on his record. And I thought that was the end of it. But it wasn't, Abigail said softly. No, because in that town there were casualties. 12 civilians died in the fires, and I was there. I wore the same uniform as Harden. In some of the testimony, my name got mixed up with his. Confusion about who gave which orders, who did what. When they wrote up the reports, it looked like I was part of it, like I'd participated in the atrocities instead of trying to stop them. But you have the truth. You have the testimony. I have my word against official army records that say otherwise. And out here, where nobody knows me and nobody cares what really happened, my word doesn't count for much. He finally looked at her. Harden's been carrying that grudge for 12 years. When he saw me in those woods, he recognized me. That's why he came after you. Not because you refused him, but because hurting you would hurt me. He wants revenge for ruining his military career. Abigail felt cold, despite the warming morning air. What will you do? I don't know. If I stay and fight, he'll spread those reports all over the territory. Make it look like I'm a war criminal hiding from justice. The army might even send someone to investigate. At the very least, it'll destroy any trust I've built here. People will think I'm a monster, but you're not. I'm not sure what I am anymore. He stood up, pacing the small yard. I've killed men, Abigail. In the war and after. Not always because I had to, but because it was expedient. Because it was easier to pull a trigger than to find another way. I've got blood on my hands that won't wash off, no matter how many years I spend alone in the mountains. You saved my life, she said firmly. You've protected this town. That's what matters now, is it? Or am I just postponing the inevitable? Maybe Hardin's right to come after me. Maybe I deserve— Stop! Abigail stood and crossed to him, taking his hands in hers. They were rough and scarred, the hands of a man who'd lived hard. You don't deserve to be hunted by a man like Dutch Hardin. And this town needs you. I need you. Something shifted in his expression. Abigail, I know it's not proper for me to say this. I know we've only known each other a few weeks. But I've seen who you are, Elias. I've seen your kindness and your courage and your pain. And I'm not letting you run away because of lies from 12 years ago. He pulled his hands free, but gently. You don't know what you're asking. If I stay, if I fight him, people will die. Maybe him, maybe his men, maybe innocent folks caught in the crossfire. That's what happens when men like us go to war. Then we make sure the innocent folks are protected. We plan, we prepare, we don't let him dictate the terms. How? He's got at least 8 men now. I've been watching him recruit. He's building a small army, pulling in every drifter and gunman he can find. And he's got the territorial law on his side if he plays this right. I'm one man with a bad reputation and a rifle. You're not alone. The voice came from behind them, and they both turned to find Samuel Henderson standing at the edge of the schoolyard. The old prospector looked older than his 60 years, but his eyes were sharp and his jaw was set. I heard some of what you said, and I reckon half the town's been waiting to see what you'd decide. Samuel, Elias started, but the prospector held up a hand. Let me finish. We've all seen what you've done for Miss Carter and for this town. We know Dutch Hardin's a snake, and we know whatever he's saying about you is probably twisted truth at best. Some of us fought in that war too. We know how complicated it was, how good men sometimes had to do hard things. This isn't your fight, Elias said. The hell it isn't. Hardin and his gang have been terrorizing this valley for months, taking what they want, pushing folks around, making everyone afraid. You gave us hope that someone could stand up to them. You think we're going to let you walk away now? Young Thomas Brennan appeared from the road, leading his horse. Samuel's right, Mr. McGraw. My pa says he'll ride with you if it comes to fighting. So will the Morrison brothers and half the ranch hands in the valley. You're talking about a range war, Elias said. About men dying over my past mistakes. We're talking about defending our homes, Samuel corrected. About making this territory safe for teachers and children and decent folks. If that means standing between you and Hardin's lies, then that's what we'll do. Abigail saw the conflict playing across Elias's face. He'd spent years isolating himself, convincing himself that he was better off alone, that attachment only led to loss. Now people were offering exactly what he'd avoided: connection, community, the burden and blessing of being responsible to others. I need to think, he finally said. I need to figure out how to do this without getting everyone killed. You've got 10 days until Hardin's deadline, Thomas said. Whatever you decide, we're with you. The 2 men left, and Elias sank back down onto the steps, his head in his hands. Abigail sat beside him, not touching but close enough that he could feel her presence. You don't have to decide this moment, she said quietly, but you do have to decide. Because running won't solve anything. Hardin will just find another target, hurt other people. And you'll spend the rest of your life knowing you could have stopped him, but chose not to. I'm tired of fighting, Abigail. I've been fighting my whole adult life. I know. But sometimes the fight finds us whether we want it or not. The question isn't whether to fight, it's what we're fighting for. And I think you know the answer to that. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw in his eyes the same thing she felt in her own heart, something neither of them had planned for, something that had grown in the spaces between teaching and target practice, in quiet conversations and shared silences. "If I do this," he said slowly, "if I stand and fight, people I care about could get hurt. You could get hurt. I'm already in danger. We both are. The only question is whether we face it together or alone." He nodded slowly, some decision settling in him. "Together, then. But we do this smart. We prepare, we plan, and we make sure that when Harden comes, we're ready." How do we start? We start by finding out exactly what we're up against, how many men he has, what weapons, what his plan is. And then we figure out how to turn his own trap against him. Elias stood and offered his hand to help her up. When she took it, he held on a moment longer than necessary, his thumb brushing across her knuckles in a gesture that was half promise, half prayer. "Thank you," he said, "for believing in me when I'm not sure I believe in myself." "That's what partners do," Abigail replied. They believe for each other when the way gets dark. The sun had fully risen now, and Ironwood Valley was waking to another day. But something had changed in that early morning conversation. Lines had been drawn, alliances had been forged, and the quiet mountain man, who'd wanted nothing more than to be left alone, had found something worth fighting for again. Dutch Hardin had made a mistake when he'd threatened Abigail Carter. He'd given Elias McGraw a reason to come down from his mountain and reminded him that some things mattered more than avoiding pain. Now, they just had to make sure they survived what came. Next, 1 month after the incident in the woods, tension in Ironwood Valley had reached a breaking point. Dutch Hardin's gang had grown bolder in their harassment, riding through town at odd hours, making veiled threats, smashing windows at businesses whose owners had spoken in support of Elias. Marshal Clayton had packed his belongings and left town 3 days ago, leaving a hastily scrawled resignation letter nailed to his office door. The territory was now without law, and everyone knew it. Elias had spent the week since his conversation with Abigail preparing. He'd scouted the mountain passes, looking for defensible positions. He'd taught Samuel Henderson and Thomas Brennan basic tactics, how to use cover, how to coordinate fire, how to stay calm when bullets started flying. He'd distributed weapons to those willing to fight and taught them to shoot straight. But what they really needed was a plan. And for that, they needed to know exactly what Hardin was planning. On the evening of the 28th day, the town called a meeting at the schoolhouse. 32 people showed up, nearly every adult in Ironwood Valley. They crowded onto the benches, meant for children, their faces grave in the lamplight. Elias stood at the front of the room, uncomfortable with the attention but understanding the necessity. Abigail sat in the front row, the small medicine bag Elias had shown her weeks ago now hanging around her own neck, a gift he'd given her the night before, a piece of his time with the crow and a symbol of protection. "Most of you know why we're here," Elias began, his voice carrying to the back of the room. "Dutch Hardin has given us an ultimatum: leave the territory or face consequences. His deadline is in 2 days. Then we leave," someone called from the back. "It's not worth dying over. Where would we go?" Martha Pritchard asked. "This is our home. We've built lives here. Do we just abandon everything because some outlaw says so?" "We stay and fight," Samuel Henderson said firmly. "We've got right on our side." "Right doesn't stop bullets," another voice countered. The room erupted in argument, everyone talking over each other. Elias let it go on for a minute, then held up his hand for silence. "Listen to me, all of you. I'm not going to stand here and tell you what to do with your lives. If you want to leave, I understand. If you want to stay and hope Hardin forgets about us, that's your choice too. But I'm staying, and I'm going to make sure that if Hardin comes for this town, he regrets it." "How?" John Pritchard asked. "You're 1 man against 8, maybe more. Those are bad odds. They are if we fight on his terms. But we're not going to do that." Elias pulled out a map he'd drawn of the valley and the surrounding mountains, spreading it on the table. The harvest festival is in 3 days, day after Hardin's deadline. Everyone in the territory will be here. Hardin knows that. He's planning something big, something public. He wants to humiliate me the way I humiliated him. How do you know that? Thomas asked. Because that's what I'd do if I were him. He's got pride and anger driving him, and men like that need an audience for their revenge. Elias pointed to the map. So we give him what he wants, a public confrontation. But we control where it happens and how it happens. You're talking about turning the festival into a battlefield, Martha said quietly. I'm talking about protecting this town. We evacuate the children to the Morrison Ranch. It's 5 miles away and defensible. We position armed men at key points around the square. And when Hardin makes his move, we're ready. You're asking us to risk our lives, someone said. I'm asking you to defend your homes. There's a difference. Elias looked around the room, meeting each person's eyes. I know what I'm asking isn't easy. I know some of you might die if this goes wrong. But if we don't stand up now, Hardin and men like him will run roughshod over this territory forever. Every town will be like this one, afraid, powerless, waiting for someone else to save them. Abigail stood then, and the room fell quiet. Everyone knew she was the reason this had started, and they respected her enough to listen. I came here from Boston to teach children, she said, to bring education and hope to the frontier. I still believe, that civilization is built not with guns, but with books and kindness and the willingness to help one another. But I've learned something these past weeks. Civilization needs protectors too. It needs people willing to stand between the innocent and those who would harm them. She turned to look at Elias, and the affection in her eyes was clear for everyone to see. Elias McGraw is a good man who's made hard choices in hard times. Dutch Hardin is a cruel man who's chosen to hurt others for his own satisfaction. If we let Hardin win because we're afraid, we're telling our children that cruelty triumphs over goodness. I won't teach that lesson. The room was silent for a long moment. Then Samuel Henderson stood. I'm in. Whatever you need, Elias, I'll do it. Thomas Brennan stood next. Me too. One by one the Morrison brothers stood. Then John Pritchard, then a dozen others, until more than half the room was on their feet. We'll need to coordinate, Elias said, his voice rough with emotion. Samuel, you and the Morrison brothers will take the north side of the square. Thomas, you'll be in the church steeple with a rifle. You've got the best eyes in the valley. John, you'll help me evacuate the children before dawn on festival day. He continued laying out the plan, assigning positions and responsibilities. They would make the town square into a killing zone for anyone who came looking for blood. They would protect their own with the same fierceness that had built homesteads in hostile territory and carved farms from wilderness. But even as the planning continued and the resolve in the room strengthened, Abigail saw the weight of it settling on Elias's shoulders. He was a man who'd sought peace through isolation, and now he was leading others into violence. The contradiction of it, the necessity of it, was written in every line of his weathered face. When the meeting finally broke up near midnight, only Abigail and Elias remained. They stood in the lamplight, the map between them covered in markings and notes. This could go very wrong, Elias said quietly. People could die because of decisions I make. People could die because of decisions Dutch Hardin makes, Abigail corrected. You're just trying to minimize the damage. Is that enough? She moved closer, close enough to feel the warmth of him. It has to be. We can't control everything, Elias. We can only do our best and trust that righteousness counts for something. He reached up and touched the medicine bag at her throat, his fingers gentle. Running Wolf told me once that the mountain gives strength to those who respect it, that the land protects those who protect the land. I think he was talking about more than just rocks and trees. What do you think he meant? That we're all connected. That when you stand up for what's right, the world stands up with you. Even if you can't see it in the moment. He let his hand fall. I hope he was right, because I'm betting a lot of lives on it. They stood in silence, the weight of what was coming pressing down on them both. In 2 days, Dutch Hardin's deadline would pass. In 3 days, the Harvest Festival would bring the confrontation they'd been preparing for. And after that, either Ironwood Valley would still stand, or it would become just another footnote in the violent history of the frontier. Abigail thought about her mother's locket, about her brother, who died because lawless men faced no consequences. She thought about the children she taught and the future they deserved. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that whatever fear she felt was less important than standing beside the man who'd chosen to protect them. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Good," Elias said. "Fear keeps you sharp. It's the people who aren't afraid that get killed. Will you stay with me tonight?" "Not," she blushed in the lamplight, "not like that, but just stay." "I don't want to be alone." He nodded, understanding what she wasn't saying, that the world felt too dangerous for either of them to face alone anymore, that whatever was building between them was real enough to lean on. They sat on the schoolhouse steps as the night deepened, watching stars wheel overhead and listening to the mountain wind in the pines. Tomorrow would bring more preparation. The day after would bring Hardin's deadline. And the day after that would bring fire and blood and the kind of reckoning that defined who lived and who died on the frontier. But tonight, they had each other and the quiet certainty that some things were worth fighting for, even if the cost was high. 2 days before the Harvest Festival, Elias went up into the mountains one final time. He needed to scout the high passes, to make sure Hardin hadn't positioned men where they could trap the townspeople between two forces. The sun was just cresting the peaks when he found the camp. It was well hidden, tucked into a narrow canyon about 3 miles from town. 6 men, their horses picketed nearby, supplies stacked under oiled canvas. They were professionals, these men, not the rough drifters Hardin usually employed. Their weapons were well maintained, their camp organized with military precision. Elias watched from a ridge above, counting men and weapons, noting their routines. He was about to slip away when he saw something that made his blood run cold. A saddlebag hung from a tree branch, and caught in the morning light was the corner of a document. Something about it drew his attention. The quality of the paper, the official look of it. While the men were occupied with breakfast, Elias worked his way down the canyon wall, moving silent as smoke through the rocks. He reached the saddlebag and carefully extracted the paper. What he saw made the world tilt beneath him. It was military correspondence, dated 1864. Orders from the Shenandoah campaign. And there, among the official reports and testimonies, was his name, alongside Dutch Hardin's. But as Elias read through the documents with shaking hands, he realized something that changed everything he thought he knew about the past 12 years. Dutch Hardin hadn't just been a lieutenant in his unit. He'd been in the same regiment under the same commander. They'd served together for 8 months before the raid on that Virginia town. And the documents showed that Hardin had specifically requested Elias as scout for that mission, had wanted him there as witness. More than that, the papers contained testimony that Elias had never seen. His own words, given at the court-martial but edited in the transcripts, where he'd said Lieutenant Hardin ordered the men to fire on civilians. The official record showed Lieutenant McGraw and Lieutenant Hardin ordered the men to fire on civilians. Someone had deliberately altered the testimony to implicate him equally with Hardin, and that someone, according to the signature at the bottom of the revision memo, had been their commanding officer, a colonel named Preston, who'd been trying to cover up his own role in allowing the atrocities to happen. Elias's hands trembled as he read further. There were letters between Hardin and Preston, discussing how to manage the McGraw problem, how to make sure if anyone took the fall for what happened in that Virginia town, it would be the scout who'd caused trouble by reporting it. But there was more. And this was the part that made Elias's stomach turn to ice. There was a photograph tucked between the official documents. It showed a group of Union officers standing in front of a command tent. Elias recognized himself immediately. Younger, thinner, wearing the uniform he'd burned after the war. Beside him stood Dutch Hardin, also younger, his face unscarred and smiling, and on the back of the photograph, In Hardin's handwriting were words that recontextualized everything. McGraw and me, before he destroyed my career, before he made me what I am. This ends at Ironwood Valley. This wasn't about random violence or wounded pride from a single encounter in the woods. This was personal vendetta that had been building for 12 years. Hardin had recognized Elias the moment he'd seen him in Ironwood Valley. The encounter with Abigail hadn't been coincidence. It had been orchestrated specifically to draw Elias out, to force him into a position where he'd have to reveal himself. Abigail had never been the target. She'd been bait from the very beginning, and Hardin's plan went deeper than Elias had imagined. According to notes scrawled in the margins of the documents, Hardin had been planning this for months. He'd filed formal complaints with the territorial government about an unnamed war criminal hiding in the Montana Territory. He'd requested Army investigators be sent to Ironwood Valley on the exact date of the Harvest Festival. Whether Elias fought or fled, whether he won or lost against Hardin's gang, the army would arrive to find either a dead fugitive or one they could arrest. Hardin had made sure that no matter what happened, Elias's reputation would be destroyed and his freedom lost. It was a trap within a trap. And Elias had walked right into it. He was so focused on the documents that he didn't hear the footsteps behind him until it was too late. A gun cocked and a familiar voice spoke from the shadows. "You always were good at reconnaissance, McGraw, but you're getting old. Time was. I could never sneak up on you." Elias turned slowly, the papers still in his hand. The scarred man stood 10 feet away, pistol aimed at Elias's chest, his ugly smile back in place. "Dutch figured you'd come snouting around eventually. That's why he left those papers where you'd find them. Wanted you to know exactly how screwed you are before the end. He altered the records," Elias said, his voice flat. "He and Preston framed me for things I tried to stop. Did they? I wouldn't know about that. All I know is Dutch pays well, and he wants you dead." The scarred man's finger tightened on the trigger. "Nothing personal, old man. Just business." The shot that rang out didn't come from the scarred man's pistol. It came from the ridge above, and it took the outlaw in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his gun flying. He fell hard, clutching his wound and cursing. Samuel Henderson emerged from the rocks, his old cavalry rifle still smoking.
"Thought you might want company up here."
"Elias, turns out I was right." 2 more townsmen appeared, the Morrison brothers, both armed, both looking grimly satisfied at having caught one of Hardin's men. "Tie him up," Elias ordered, then turned back to the camp below. The shot had alerted the other men, and they were scrambling for weapons. "We need to get out of here, now!" They dragged the scarred man with them, working their way back up the canyon wall as bullets kicked up rock dust around them. By the time Hardin's men organized a pursuit, Elias and his companions were already over the ridge and heading down the far side of the mountain. They made it back to town by mid-afternoon, the scarred man stumbling between the Morrison brothers with his hands bound. The whole town turned out to see them arrive. Elias called another emergency meeting. This time, 40 people showed up, crowding into the schoolhouse and spilling out into the yard. He laid out the documents on the table where everyone could see. "I need you all to understand what we're really up against," he began. Then he told them everything. The raid in Virginia, the court-martial, the altered testimony, Hardin's long-planned revenge. He held nothing back, showed them every piece of evidence, let them see the depths of corruption and malice that had brought them to this moment. When he finished, the room was silent for a long time. Finally, Abigail stood. Her face was pale, but her voice was steady. "Dutch Hardin used me to get to you. He put me in danger, terrorized this whole town, all because of something that happened 12 years ago. Something you tried to stop." "It doesn't matter what I tried to do," Elias said bitterly. "All that matters is what's in those records. And those records say I'm guilty." "No." Thomas Brennan stood up, holding one of the documents. "These records say someone powerful wanted you silenced." "That's different. That's proof that you were telling the truth and they were lying." "The army won't see it that way," Elias said. Hardin's already invited investigators to the festival. They'll arrest me on sight, take me back for trial. And even if I could prove my innocence eventually, by then this town will be undefended, and Hardin will do whatever he wants. Then we don't let them take you, Samuel said firmly. We stand together, all of us, and we tell those investigators the truth about what happened here. About how Hardin terrorized us, about how you protected us. It's not that simple. Yes, it is. Abigail moved to stand beside him, taking his hand in full view of everyone gathered. You've been alone with this for too long, carrying guilt that wasn't yours to carry. But you're not alone anymore. We know who you are. We know what you've done for us. And we're not letting anyone take you without a fight. A murmur of agreement ran through the crowd. People Elias barely knew were nodding, their faces set with determination. He'd spent 12 years convinced that isolation was safer, that connection only led to loss. But these people were offering him something he'd thought was gone forever, belonging. Hardin's bringing an army, Elias said, his voice rough. 8 men, maybe 10, plus whatever happens with the army investigators. We're talking about a war on multiple fronts. Then we'd better be ready, John Pritchard said. We've got 2 days to prepare. Let's make them count. The meeting transformed into a war council. They refined the plan for the festival, adding contingencies for the army investigators. They prepared evidence to show the authorities, statements from townspeople, the documents Elias had recovered, testimony from the scarred man they'd captured. And underlying all of it was a grim determination. Ironwood Valley had been pushed as far as it would go. The people here had built lives in hard country, raised children in the shadow of mountains that could kill the unprepared, created community where there had been only wilderness. They would not be driven out by a vengeful outlaw and his twisted version of justice. As the meeting finally broke up near midnight, Elias found himself alone with Abigail once more. She still held the documents, studying them in the lamplight. He's been planning this for a very long time, she said quietly. All of it, finding you, using me, bringing in the army. He must have been searching for you for years. Hate's a powerful motivator, Elias replied. And I took something from him that mattered, his reputation, his military career. In his mind, I deserve whatever he does to me. But you were right to report what he did. Those people in Virginia deserved justice. They got none. Their deaths were covered up, dismissed as casualties of war. The only person who really paid a price was me. He took the papers from her hands, looking at his younger self in that faded photograph. Maybe that's just how the world works. The powerful protect themselves, and the rest of us pay for trying to do right. I don't believe that, Abigail said fiercely. I can't believe that, or there's no point to anything I teach those children. Justice matters. Truth matters. And sometimes it takes time, but eventually things come right. You have more faith than I do. Then I'll have faith for both of us. She took his hands, making him look at her. Tomorrow we prepare. The day after we fight, and when it's over, whatever happens, at least we'll know we stood for something. He pulled her close then, holding her in a way that was both desperate and tender. She fit against him perfectly, as if they'd been designed to support each other through exactly this kind of darkness. I'm sorry you got dragged into this, he whispered into her hair. You came here to teach children, and I brought war to your doorstep. You brought yourself, she corrected, and I'm grateful for it, even if what comes with you is complicated. I'd rather face danger with you than safety without you. They stood like that for a long time, taking strength from each other as the night deepened around them. Tomorrow would bring final preparations. The next day would bring blood and fire and a reckoning that had been building for more than a decade. But tonight, in the lamplight of a frontier schoolhouse, 2 people who'd found each other against. All odds held tight and promised wordlessly that whatever came, they'd face it together. The trap was set. The players were in position, and the final act of a drama that had begun in a Virginia town 12 years ago was about to reach its conclusion in the mountains of Montana Territory. The day before the Harvest Festival dawned clear and cold. Frost rimmed the windows of the schoolhouse where Elias had spent the night keeping watch, and his breath clouded in the pre-dawn air. He'd slept perhaps 2 hours, his hand never far from his rifle, his mind running through scenarios and contingencies until they blurred together. Abigail found him at first light, bringing coffee and bread. They sat on the steps, sharing the simple meal in silence, each lost in thoughts about what the next day would bring. "I need to tell you something," Elias said finally, setting down his cup. "In case tomorrow goes wrong, don't talk like that. Listen." He took her hand, his calloused fingers rough against her skin. "I've lived a hard life, made plenty of mistakes, carried more guilt than any one man should have to bear. But these last few weeks, knowing you, being part of this community, it's reminded me what I was fighting for in the first place. Why I reported Hardin all those years ago. You don't have to justify anything to me, I know, but I want to say it anyway." He looked at her, those flint-gray eyes softer than she'd ever seen them. "I reported Hardin because I believed there had to be rules, even in war. Lines you don't cross. I believed that protecting the innocent mattered more than following orders, and after everything that happened, after the way it all went wrong, I stopped believing any of that. Thought maybe the world was just cruel, and there was no point trying to make it better. What changed? You did. This town did, seeing people willing to stand up for what's right, even when it's dangerous, even when it would be easier to look away." He squeezed her hand gently. "You reminded me that the fight matters, even if you don't always win, especially if you don't always win." Abigail felt tears prick her eyes. When this is over, if I'm still alive, I want to build something, a real home, not just a cabin to hide in. Maybe here, if the town will have me. Maybe somewhere else if they won't, but somewhere with you if you'll consider it." She touched his face, feeling the rough stubble of his unshaven jaw. "I've been considering it since you stepped out of those trees and told Dutch Hardin he'd picked the wrong woods. I just didn't know how to say it." He kissed her then, soft and careful, a promise more than passion. When they pulled apart, the sun had risen enough to paint the mountains gold, and Ironwood Valley was waking to its final day of preparation. The town transformed into a fortress that day. Under Elias's direction and Samuel's organizational skills, every able-bodied person had a role to play. The women and older children packed supplies and prepared the Morrison Ranch as a refuge. The men positioned themselves around the town square, memorizing sight lines and practicing coordination. Elias distributed the weapons they had: rifles, shotguns, pistols, even a few old cavalry sabers someone had kept from the war. He showed them how to reload quickly, how to make every shot count, how to stay calm when chaos erupted around them. Thomas Brennan took position in the church steeple with a scoped rifle and a clear view of every approach to town. The Morrison brothers fortified the livery stable on the north side of the square. Samuel Henderson and John Pritchard took the feed store on the south side. Others scattered to positions that would create overlapping fields of fire. "Remember," Elias told them during the final briefing, "Hardin will come in expecting us to scatter, to be afraid. He'll try to make an example of me in front of everyone. Let him think he's in control. Let him get overconfident. And when I give the signal," he pulled out the battered brass compass his father had given him a lifetime ago, "when I drop this compass, that's when we spring the trap." "What's the signal for the army investigators?" someone asked. "Assuming they show up?" "The schoolhouse bell. 3 rings means federal authorities arriving. If that happens, everyone stands down except our witnesses. We present our evidence peacefully and let the law sort it out. And if they don't believe us?" Elias's expression was grim. "Then we're all going to jail, or worse. But at least we'll have tried doing it the right way." As the day wore on and the preparations continued, Elias found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. From that Pennsylvania furniture shop where he'd learned his father's trade, to the battlefields of Virginia where he'd learned to kill, to the Crow camps where he'd learned to live with the land, to his isolated cabin where he'd tried to forget everything he'd learned. And now here, in a frontier town barely worthy of the name, preparing to defend people he'd known for only a few months, but who felt more like family than anyone had in years. He checked on the captured outlaw. The scarred man was secured in the old root cellar beneath the general store, guarded by two men with orders to keep him alive and ready to testify if needed. The man had talked. Once Samuel had convinced him that cooperation was his only path to avoiding a noose. He'd confirmed Hardin's numbers, 10 men total, all experienced with violence, and his plan to make a public spectacle of executing Elias. "Dutch wants everyone to see you die slow," the scarred man had said, his voice still carrying that ugly edge despite his circumstances. "Wants to string you up, let you hang there while he explains to the whole town what you did in the war. Make you a lesson about what happens to men who think they're better than their betters." "He's going to be disappointed," Elias had replied. As afternoon turned to evening, Elias made one final trip up to his cabin in the mountains. He needed to collect a few things, but more than that, he needed a moment alone with the life he was leaving behind. The cabin was small and spare, built with his own hands from pine logs and furnished with pieces he'd carved during long winters. It had been his sanctuary and his prison, the place where he'd hidden from the world and from himself. He packed his few possessions, extra ammunition, some dried meat, a change of clothes. And then he took down from the mantel the one item he'd carried with him through everything, a small tin-type photograph of his wife and daughter, taken the week before he'd left for the war. Sarah had been 23, bright-eyed and smiling. Little Margaret had been 5, sitting on her mother's lap, too young to understand that her father might not come back. He traced their faces with one finger, allowing himself a moment of grief for all the years they'd been gone, all the life they should have shared. "I'm sorry I couldn't save you," he whispered to the image, "but maybe I can save someone else. Maybe that's enough." He tucked the photograph into his shirt pocket next to his heart and walked out of the cabin. He didn't look back. Whatever happened tomorrow, he wouldn't be returning to this lonely place. He'd either build something new with Abigail and the town, or he'd be dead. There was no third option anymore. Back in Ironwood Valley, night had fallen, and the town was eerily quiet. People were in their positions, waiting. The festival decorations hung from posts and railings, bunting and ribbons that would frame tomorrow's violence in grotesque celebration. Elias found Abigail at the schoolhouse, cleaning and organizing as if tomorrow would bring nothing more dramatic than another day of lessons. He recognized it for what it was, a way of maintaining control, of holding on to normalcy when everything was about to change. "The children are all safely at the Morrison Ranch," she said, without looking up from the primers she was straightening. "Martha went with them. She'll keep them occupied with games and stories." "Good." He moved to stand beside her. "You don't have to stay tomorrow, you know. You could go with them. Be safe. We've had this conversation." Now she did look at him, and her eyes were fierce. "I'm staying. I'm fighting." End of discussion. He pulled the derringer from his coat, the pearl-handled pistol that had been his wife's that he'd given to Abigail weeks ago. "You remember what I taught you? Aim for the chest. Fire both barrels. Don't hesitate." She took the pistol, checking it with the competence he'd drilled into her. "I remember everything you taught me, Elias. I know you do. You're a quick study." He produced a small box from his pocket. "But I got you something more. From the general store last week." Inside the box was a small pocket watch. Nothing fancy, just functional brass. But engraved on the back were her initials, AC, "So you'll always know what time it is," he said with a small smile. "And so you'll have something to remember me by if—" She kissed him, cutting off the dark thought. When she pulled back, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "You're coming back from this," she said firmly. "We both are. And then we're building that home you talked about. And I'm going to teach our children." She stopped, blushing. "I mean any children we might have someday." "Our children," he agreed, his voice warm. "I like the sound of that." They held each other as the night deepened, taking what comfort they could from proximity and shared purpose. Around them, the town waited. Weapons were loaded. Positions were set. The trap was ready. At midnight, Elias walked the perimeter one final time, checking on each position, making sure everyone knew their role. Thomas in the steeple gave him a confident nod. The Morrison brothers were calm and ready. Samuel Henderson looked older than his years, but steady as stone. "We're ready," Samuel said. "Whatever comes tomorrow, we're ready." "I hope so," Elias replied. "I truly hope so." He returned to the schoolhouse as the moon rose over the mountains. Abigail had laid out blankets on the floor, creating a makeshift bed. They lay together, not sleeping but not quite awake either, existing in that liminal space between day and day, between the life they'd known and whatever came next. "Tell me about Pennsylvania," she said softly. "About your father's shop before the war." So he did. He told her about the smell of fresh-cut wood and linseed oil, about learning to read the grain of oak and maple, about the satisfaction of creating something beautiful and functional with his own hands. He told her about Sunday dinners with his parents and siblings, about ice skating on the frozen creek in winter, about all the small, precious details of a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. And she told him about Boston, about her brother Samuel, who died too young, about her mother's genteel influence and her father's stern principles, about the decision to come west that had seemed so brave at the time and so foolish in retrospect, and yet had led her here to this moment with this man. They talked until their words ran out, and then they simply held each other, listening to each other breathe, feeling the warmth of living bodies in a cold world. Dawn would bring Dutch Harden and his vengeance. It would bring army investigators and judgment. It would bring violence and chaos and the kind of reckoning that left nothing unchanged. But in the darkness before that dawn, Abigail Carter and Elias McGraw found something that both of them had thought lost forever: hope. Not the blind optimism of youth, but the earned, hard-won hope of people who'd seen darkness and chosen light anyway. They'd stand together. They'd fight together. And whatever came after, they'd face it together. The mountain watched over them, patient and eternal. And in the morning, it would bear witness to whether the protection Running Wolf had promised was real, or just another beautiful lie told to comfort the dying. The harvest festival began at 10 in the morning, and by noon, Ironwood Valley Square was filled with people who didn't know they were standing in the middle of a carefully laid trap. Families from neighboring ranches had come for the celebration, bringing food and children and an air of festivity that felt surreal given what Elias knew was coming. The decorations fluttered in the autumn breeze. A makeshift stage had been erected where musicians played fiddles and guitars. Tables groaned under the weight of pies and roasted meat. Children ran between the adults, their laughter high and innocent. But beneath the celebration, Elias felt the tension humming like a plucked wire. Thomas was in the steeple, his rifle carefully concealed. The Morrison brothers loitered near the livery stable, appearing casual but ready. Samuel Henderson stood by the feed store, one hand never far from his coat where a pistol waited. Abigail stood with a group of women near the schoolhouse, the derringer hidden in the folds of her skirt. She caught Elias's eye across the square and gave him a small nod. "Ready." Elias checked his father's compass one more time, feeling its familiar weight. Everything depended on timing. Let Harden make his grand entrance. Let him think he controlled the situation, and then spring the trap before he could hurt anyone. At 1 o'clock, the music stopped. Riders appeared at the south end of the square, 10 men on horseback, moving in formation that spoke of military training. Dutch Harden led them, sitting tall in his saddle, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. The scar on his face stood out livid against his sun-darkened skin. The crowd parted like water, families pulling children close, men moving instinctively in front of their women. The festive atmosphere evaporated, replaced by the cold weight of fear. Hardin reined in his horse in the center of the square, his men spreading out in a loose semicircle that cut off the southern exit. He swept his gaze across the gathered townspeople, and when his eyes found Elias, he smiled. "Elias McGraw," Hardin called out, his voice carrying across the sudden silence. "I believe we have business to settle." Elias stepped forward, his hands visible and empty. The sharp's rifle was leaning against the schoolhouse wall, deliberately out of reach. He wanted Hardin confident, wanted him to believe this would be easy. Hardin, you're a long way from where you should be, where I should be. That's rich coming from you. Hardin dismounted slowly, theatrically, making sure everyone was watching. Tell me, McGraw, have you told these good people what you really are? What you did in the war? I've told them everything. They know about Virginia. They know about the court-martial. They know what you did and what I tried to stop. Hardin laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Is that the story you're telling? That you're some kind of hero? That you tried to save those civilians? He pulled papers from his coat, the same documents Elias had found in the mountain camp. I have proof right here that says different. Official army records that show you participated in the massacre. That you're a war criminal who's been hiding in these mountains for 12 years. Murmurs ran through the crowd. People who'd been prepared to trust Elias now looked uncertain, afraid. This was the moment Hardin had been waiting for, the chance to destroy Elias's credibility before the violence even started. Those records were altered, Elias said calmly, by your commanding officer to protect himself and you. The real testimony is different. The real testimony. Hardin's voice dripped with scorn. You mean your version? The convenient story you told to save your own skin. He turned to address the crowd. This man destroyed my military career with his lies, and now he's doing the same thing here, making himself out to be your protector, when he's really just a coward and a killer. Funny thing about that, Samuel Henderson spoke up from his position by the feed store. We got testimony from one of your men, the one with the scar who tried to bushwhack Elias in the mountains. He had some interesting things to say about your plans. Hardin's expression flickered, the first crack in his confidence. You're bluffing, am I? Samuel held up a sheaf of papers. Signed confession, witnessed by 3 townspeople. Details about how you've been planning this for months. How you used Miss Carter as bait. How you invited army investigators here to make sure Elias got arrested, even if you didn't kill him. Now the crowd was turning, their fear giving way to anger. They'd been manipulated, used as pawns in Hardin's revenge game. And frontier people didn't take kindly to being used. Doesn't matter, Hardin snarled. Those investigators will be here any minute. And when they arrive, they'll see McGraw for what he is, a fugitive who needs to hang. Maybe, Elias said quietly. Or maybe they'll see a town defending itself against a gang of outlaws who've been terrorizing this territory for months. He raised his voice. Dutch Hardin, I'm giving you one chance. You and your men ride out now, leave this valley and don't come back. Or we end this here today. Hardin's hand moved toward his pistol. You think I'm afraid of you, old man? You think these shopkeepers and farmers scare me? I think you should be afraid. Elias's voice was cold as mountain stone. Because you made a mistake when you came after Abigail Carter. You woke up something in this town, and now you're going to pay for it. Big words from a man without a gun. Hardin drew his pistol, aiming it at Elias's chest. Last words, McGraw. Make them good. Elias looked up at the church steeple, where he knew Thomas was sighting down his rifle. He glanced at the livery stable, where the Morrison brothers waited. He met Abigail's eyes across the square, and saw her hand move toward the derringer, hidden in her skirts. Then he pulled his father's compass from his pocket and let it fall. The brass compass hit the packed earth of the square with a sound like a bell. Ringing, and Ironwood Valley went to war. The first shot came from the church steeple. Thomas's rifle spoke with authority, and one of Hardin's men toppled from his saddle before anyone else could react. The second and third shots came from the Morrison brothers at the livery, dropping 2 more outlaws in quick succession. Chaos erupted. Hardin's remaining men scattered, diving for cover and returning fire. Townspeople screamed and ran, but in organized patterns they'd rehearsed, away from the crossfire. Toward the buildings, protecting the vulnerable, Elias dove and rolled, coming up with the sharp's rifle he'd positioned against the schoolhouse wall. He fired once, the big .50 caliber round catching an outlaw who'd taken aim at Samuel. The man went down hard and didn't move. Abigail dropped behind a wagon, the derringer in her hand. One of Hardin's men rushed toward her position, and she did exactly what Elias had taught her. aimed for the chest, and fired both barrels. The outlaw stumbled and fell, clutching his shoulder where one of the small bullets had found home. The square transformed into a battlefield. Gunfire echoed off buildings. Horses screamed and bolted. The carefully arranged festival became a maze of cover and killing zones. Dutch Harden fought his way toward the schoolhouse, firing his pistol with practiced accuracy. He was heading for Elias with single-minded determination, ignoring everything else. This wasn't about victory anymore. It was about making sure that if he went down, he took Elias McGraw with him. Samuel and John provided covering fire from their positions, but Harden's remaining men were putting up fierce resistance. These weren't random drifters. They were professionals who knew how to fight, and they sold their lives dearly. The Morrison brothers took a hit, one of them going down with a leg wound. Thomas's rifle barked from the steeple, methodical and deadly, but there were too many targets and too much chaos. Elias reloaded the sharps with hands that were steady despite the adrenaline. He'd been here before, in Virginia and a dozen other places, where men killed each other over principles and pride. But this time felt different. This time he was fighting not just to survive, but to protect something precious. He spotted Harden moving through the smoke and confusion, getting closer. They locked eyes across 30 yards of hell, and in that moment, 12 years of hatred and pain compressed into pure intention. They were going to settle this finally and forever, but before either could move, the sound that everyone had been dreading rang across the square. The schoolhouse bell. 3 clear tolls that cut through the gunfire. The army investigators had arrived. 4 men on horseback appeared at the north end of the square, wearing cavalry uniforms and carrying the authority of the federal government. They took in the scene with professional efficiency. The dead and wounded, the townspeople with weapons, the ongoing firefight. Cease fire. The lead officer's voice was trained to carry over battlefield noise. In the name of the United States Army, cease fire immediately. The effect was immediate. The townspeople lowered their weapons, stepping back from their positions. They'd discuss this. If the army came, they'd cooperate, present their evidence. Let the law work as it was supposed to, but Harden's remaining men, 3 of them still standing, cornered and desperate, didn't stop. They kept firing, and one of their bullets caught the lead army officer in the arm, spinning him from his saddle. That changed everything. The other 3 officers drew their weapons and returned fire with military precision. Harden's men went down in seconds, overwhelmed by trained soldiers who'd survived actual war and weren't impressed by frontier outlaws. In the sudden quiet that followed, with gun smoke drifting through the square and the groans of the wounded filling the air, Dutch Harden stood alone. His men were dead or captured. His grand revenge had collapsed into smoking ruin, and between him and any hope of escape stood Elias McGraw. "Just you and me now," Harden said, his voice raw. "The way it should have been from the start." "Holster your weapon," one of the army officers commanded, pressing a cloth to his wounded arm. "Both of you, this is over." "It's not over until McGraw pays for what he did." Harden's pistol was still aimed at Elias, his finger tight on the trigger. "He destroyed my life. He took everything from me." "You destroyed your own life," Elias said quietly. "In that Virginia town when you ordered those civilians killed. Everything that came after was consequence, not injustice. Liar!" Harden's hand shook with rage and exhaustion. "You self-righteous son of a—" He pulled the trigger, but Elias had been reading his body language, watching for the telltale tension that preceded the shot. He moved as Harden fired, dropping and rolling in one fluid motion that spoke of a lifetime of survival instinct. The bullet passed through empty air. Elias came up with the sharps, aimed at Harden's chest from 15 feet away. The range was point blank. The shot was impossible to miss. Time seemed to stop. Elias's finger rested on the trigger. One squeeze, and it would be over. Harden dead. The threat ended. Justice, or revenge, or whatever you wanted to call it, finally delivered. But Elias thought of the crow teaching him about balance. But taking only what you need and giving back what you can. He thought of his wife and daughter, who'd wanted him to be better than the war had made him. He thought of Abigail, watching from behind the wagon, and the life they could build if he chose mercy over vengeance. He lowered the rifle. "It's over, Hardin. You're done." The army officers moved in, disarming Hardin and forcing him to his knees. He fought them, screaming curses and promises of revenge. But it was the desperate thrashing of a beaten man who knew his time had run out. The lead officer, still bleeding from his arm wound, looked at Elias with new respect. "You're Elias McGraw?" "I am. We have questions about your service record, about incidents in Virginia during the war." "I have answers," Elias replied. "An evidence that'll show what really happened. But first, we need to tend the wounded and secure the prisoners." The officer nodded. "Agreed, but McGraw, don't think about running. We will find you." "I'm not running," Elias said, looking at Abigail as she emerged from cover. "Not anymore. I'm exactly where I belong. The battle for Ironwood Valley was over. The dead were being counted, the wounded treated, the guilty restrained. And in the middle of it all, a mountain man who'd sought isolation had instead found connection, had traded vengeance for mercy, and had discovered that sometimes the hardest battles are the ones we fight against our own worst impulses. Dutch Hardin was dragged away, still cursing, his face a mask of impotent rage. The revenge he'd planned for 12 years had lasted less than 10 minutes and cost him everything. Justice, slow and imperfect but real, had finally come to both of them. 3 months later, autumn had given way to the first true cold of winter. Snow dusted the peaks above Ironwood Valley, and the pine trees wore their white burden with ancient patience. The town had settled into a new rhythm, one marked by healing and growth rather than fear. The harvest festival that had become a battlefield was now just a memory, though not one easily forgotten. 2 townsmen had died in the fighting, Samuel Henderson and John Pritchard, both buried with full honors in the cemetery on the hill. Their graves were marked with fine headstones that Elias had carved himself, working through his grief with chisel and stone, creating monuments worthy of men who'd stood when standing was dangerous. Martha Pritchard had taken their loss hard, as had Samuel's grown children who'd come from back east for the funeral. But the town had rallied around them, the way communities do when tragedy strikes. There was an understanding now, hard-won and bone-deep, that they were all connected, that the willingness of a few to stand had saved many, and that sacrifice meant something even when the cost was terrible. Dutch Hardin and his surviving men had been taken to the territorial prison to await trial. The army investigators had spent 2 weeks in Ironwood Valley, interviewing witnesses and reviewing evidence. The altered testimony from the Virginia court-martial had been their primary interest, and when they'd cross-referenced it with Elias's original statements and the scarred man's confession, the truth had emerged like sunlight through storm clouds. Colonel Preston, the commanding officer who'd covered up the atrocities and framed Elias, was dead, had been for 7 years, but his corruption was now part of the official record. Elias's name was cleared, his service record amended to reflect what had actually happened. The army had even offered him a formal apology and a pension for the years of hardship their bureaucratic failure had caused. Elias had accepted the apology and declined the pension. He didn't need the government's money. He had everything he needed right here. The cabin he'd built at the edge of town was larger than his mountain refuge had been, with 2 bedrooms and a proper kitchen. Abigail had helped him design it, insisting on windows that faced east to catch the morning sun, and a porch where they could sit in the evenings and watch the valley settle into darkness. The furniture was all his own work. Tables and chairs, and a bed frame carved with the same pine needle motif he'd used on the schoolhouse slate frame. The school itself had expanded. With the danger past, and word spreading about the teacher who'd helped defend her town, more families had moved to the valley. Abigail now had 37 students, ranging from 5 to 16 years old. She'd hired an assistant, a young woman named Clara from Helena, who'd come seeking adventure and found purpose instead. Elias still attended Sunday services, sitting in the back row as he always had. But now he participated in community life in ways he'd never imagined. He taught wilderness survival skills on Saturday mornings to anyone who wanted to learn. He helped build new cabins for arriving families. He'd even been asked to serve as deputy to Thomas Brennan, who'd been appointed as the new town marshal, though Elias had politely declined. He'd worn enough uniforms in his life. What he enjoyed most were the quiet evenings with Abigail, when the teaching day was done and the town had settled into its nightly rhythm. They'd sit on their porch, and she'd read to him from the books she'd ordered, or they'd simply talk about their days and plans for tomorrow. Sometimes they'd sit in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge one by one above the mountains. And Elias would feel a peace he'd thought was lost to him forever. On a Sunday afternoon in late November, Elias stood before the small congregation with Abigail beside him, both dressed in their finest. The circuit preacher had come through, and they'd decided not to wait any longer. Life was too uncertain, too precious to postpone the important things. Martha Pritchard cried happy tears as she watched them exchange vows. Thomas Brennan served as best man, proud and serious in his new marshal's badge. Young Emma Pritchard was flower girl, scattering pine needles and dried flowers down the makeshift aisle. The Morrison brothers, one still limping from his wound, stood in the back and grinned at each other when Elias kissed his bride. The celebration afterward was subdued compared to what the harvest festival might have been, but it was genuine. People brought food and gifts, practical things like blankets and tools, but also beautiful things, like a quilt the women had sewn together and a hand-bound book of poetry that the children had copied out as a gift for their teacher. As evening fell and the celebration wound down, Elias and Abigail walked back to their cabin hand in hand. Snow was beginning to fall, the first real snow of the season, and it muffled the world into peaceful silence. "Mrs. McGraw," Elias said, testing out the sound of it. "Mr. McGraw," Abigail replied, smiling. Strange how natural that sounds, isn't it? Like we were always meant to end up here. Maybe we were. Maybe all of it. The war, the years alone, even Hardin. Maybe it all had to happen to bring us to this moment. That's a generous way to look at it. I'm trying to be generous these days. Holding on to bitterness only poisoned me. Better to be grateful for what I have now than angry about what I lost then. They reached their cabin, and Elias paused on the porch to look back at the town. Lights glowed in windows. Smoke rose from chimneys. Somewhere a dog barked and a child laughed. All the small, precious signs of civilization taking root in wild country. "Thank you," he said softly. "For what? For not giving up on me? For seeing something worth saving when I'd convinced myself there wasn't anything left?" Abigail squeezed his hand. "You saved me first. In those woods, when I was certain my life was over, you appeared. Like the mountain itself had sent you. Maybe it did." He touched the medicine bag that now hung around her neck alongside her mother's locket. Two talismans, two histories, woven together. Running Wolf said the mountain protects those who respect it. I think he was right. They went inside, closing the door against the cold and the dark. In the morning, there would be lessons to teach and wood to chop, and 100 small tasks that made up a life. But tonight they had each other and the warmth of a fire built in a hearth of their own making. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering the valley in white. The mountains stood eternal watch, patient and protective, sheltering all who'd found refuge in their shadow. And in a small cabin at the edge of a frontier town, two people who'd survived violence and loss and the long loneliness of isolation lay down to sleep, wrapped in each other's arms. Certain at last that they were home. The story that had begun with terror in the woods had ended with a wedding and a promise. The mountain man, who'd wanted only to be left alone, had discovered that connection was worth the risk. The schoolteacher who'd come to bring civilization to the wilderness had learned that sometimes civilization needed defending as much as teaching. And Ironwood Valley, that rough collection of buildings and hopeful families, had proven something important, that ordinary people, when pushed far enough, could stand against those who'd hurt them. That community mattered, that justice, though slow and imperfect, was worth fighting for. That sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is stand up for what's right, even when they're afraid. especially when they're afraid. The land would remember their names long after the details faded. The children would grow up hearing stories of the Harvest Festival battle, of the mountain man who'd come down from his isolation to protect them, of the teacher who'd wielded books and bullets with equal determination. The stories would grow in the telling, as stories do, becoming part of the valley's foundation like bedrock beneath soil. But the truth, the simple, profound truth, was better than any legend. It was this: two broken people had found each other in a hard place and decided that broken things could be mended, that lost things could be found, and that love and courage could bloom even in the coldest soil. And that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.